our agenda. It's what we're going to be talking about today. We're primarily going to be focusing on just a couple of things. Eco-minimalism, which we're going to define in a minute, and then how to reduce our personal footprint on the environment. At the end, we'll talk about a couple of extra items that go above and beyond just like the basic, easy sustainability tips. And then we'll have more time for questions and answers at the end of the program. So, eco-minimalism. You may have heard of terms like low impact or zero waste that have been thrown around in the sustainability world, but eco-minimalism might be a new one for you. It's a term that I believe, and don't quote me on this, but I'm pretty sure was coined by a sustainability educator who calls herself Shel Bisley. She's a really great resource on this topic, and I am going to link her YouTube channel in the resources that I send out after this. But her definition is right here on the screen. I'm just going to summarize it for you. Basically, it's a lifestyle aiming at creating the smallest possible demand on the Earth's resources by taking into account the full life cycle of anything that we use. So always from resource extraction through to the end of the life of the item. So just looking at it with a really holistic view. And I just want you to keep this definition in mind as we go forward, because we're going to come back to it. But first, what we're going to cover is just some quick basics. You've probably heard about the 3 R's of environmental sustainability. In fact, they actually say that there's 5 R's now. So reduce, reuse, recycle, those are the original 3. And then refuse and rot are the new 2. Those are the ones that they sort of added. What we're going to focus on though, and what eco-minimalism focuses on, is the first R, the big R, the most important R, which is reduce. So reducing is the most important of the R's, and here's why. First of all, most of the R's that come after reduce are all either fall under that reduce category, or they're essentially eliminated by the reduce category. So you can eliminate reusing and recycling simply by reducing the amount that we produce and we consume. Refusing, which is one of the new R's, it's just reducing the number of items that you accept. And then rot can actually be covered under reducing the amount of food waste that we send to landfill. So rotting refers to composting. So if we focus on reduce, just the one item, we're covering all of our bases because we're going to be taking care of all 5 R's. Plus, reducing has the wonderful benefit of being extremely simple, mostly passive, kind of like I think I was talking about in book club yesterday. I called it lazy person sustainability, but that's really what reducing is. And it's a huge saver of both money and resources. Most importantly though, reducing focuses on the root of the problem, which is production, rather than the aftermath of the problem, which is what recycling does. So recycling is really looking at the disposal phase, and reducing is really looking at the resource intensive phases that are at the beginning. So as you can see on this slide, there are 3 primary categories that we're going to focus on. These are what I would consider like the most bang for your buck categories. They're the ones that require minimal work and result in big outcomes. So the categories that we're going to be focusing on are emissions, specifically carbon and methane, water usage, and plastic creation and use. So greenhouse gases, talk about those. At this point, I'm pretty sure that most of us know and have heard about greenhouse gases and the negative impact that they can have on the environment. But what we don't really cover enough is which gases specifically are the ones that we need to take action on, and what the easiest actions we can take that will result in the biggest environmental payout, so to speak. So here are some quick facts about greenhouse gases. As I mentioned before, our focus is going to be on methane and carbon emissions. This is because these are the top two gases that are the most climate-forcing greenhouse gases that we release. They're causing the most harm and the most acceleration of climate change. So because we're focusing on kind of those big things that are going to have big impacts, we're going to talk specifically about a couple of things. First, the top two emission producers are animal agriculture. So that includes things like beef, dairy production, pork, chicken, etc. And then transportation. And this is really important when we're talking about transportation. We're not talking about like you and me going to the grocery store every week, or going down to the convenience store or anything like that. What we're really talking about is the transportation of goods and services around the world. So we're talking about things like shipping freighters, cargo planes, those big 18-wheeler trucks that we all see all the time. Those are all included under this umbrella of transportation, which, as you can see, the statistic is that transportation as a whole is responsible for roughly 13% of all greenhouse gas emissions annually. So specifically about carbon, you've probably heard a lot about. It's kind of got a bit of a buzz around it right now. And that's because carbon is the harmful gas that we produce the most of, with each of us Americans being responsible for producing, on average, about 17.5 megatons of CO2 annually. So as a group, you can see that we humans produce a lot of it annually, and specifically when we're looking at individual places that do release a lot of carbon, we are going to mention animal agriculture. Speaking of animal agriculture, talking about methane. So, sorry, just one second. So we just said that carbon dioxide is the greenhouse gas that we produce the most of, but it's not the only, or what I would even call the most important gas that we need to focus on. I want to talk about methane because it takes far less methane to be more destructive than carbon. So methane release primarily comes from two sources that we as individuals can focus on, and those are natural gas and livestock. Methane is extremely destructive to the environment, and it's not as easy to offset as carbon, which is something that we're going to discuss a little later. So we really need to think about ways in which we can reduce the amount that we're putting out there rather than trying to offset it. So talking about water, obviously access to clean water is essential for us to survive, but the water that you and I use in our homes is actually not a major driver of water usage in the US. And I know that we hear a lot about it, like reducing the length of showers, et cetera, like that. Make sure you turn your water off when you're brushing your teeth or whatever. But actually the majority of our water footprint comes from a variety of things, which include the food that we consume, the clothes that we wear, and the products that we use. So when we're taking all of those factors into account, the average American has a water footprint of over 750,000 gallons of water a year. So that breaks down to be roughly like 33,000 glasses of water per day, which is obviously an astronomical number. And you and I are not drinking 33,000 gallons or glasses of water each day. So where does it come from? The majority of the usage is actually calculated based on a few factors. So what you eat, for example, a pound of beef uses like over 1,800 gallons of water to produce. So what you wear, things like a cotton t-shirt, for example, requires 700 gallons of water to produce. And then things that we use. So a new set of tires, for example, for your car, that would be over 2,000 gallons of water to produce that. So there's a lot of water that goes into the production of what we use in our everyday life. So by contrast, when we're looking at something like a shower, a 10-minute shower only uses like 25 to 50 gallons of water on average. So that's really like a drop in the bucket by comparison when we're looking at our overall footprint. And we're going to talk in a minute about some really great steps that will help you reduce that water usage footprint. So just kind of stay tuned for that. We have one more topic that we're going to cover before we get into the actual tips. So plastic. And I know this is all kind of a bummer, but this is kind of like the last fact-based slide that we're going to go over. I'm sure you've probably noticed that plastic has gotten a bad rap, especially lately, and especially talking about things like plastic water bottles, single-use plastics. And there's a reason why we've really been demonizing plastic lately. The reason being that plastic cannot and will not biodegrade. It's here essentially forever. It breaks down into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces, and we actually start to call those microplastics once they get to a certain size, but they don't ever really go away. And that's one of the reasons why, as you can see, one of the bullet points on this is that the majority of the trash that is in our ocean is made of plastic. And that's because it doesn't biodegrade. It never goes away. It's here to stay. And recycling, just quite frankly, it's not enough to take care of this problem, this disposal and end of use problem that we have. Like most things in a capitalist society, recycling is a business. So if we're looking at it from that perspective, if the item isn't profitable enough to recycle, which most plastics are not, it's just not going to be prioritized. So if we look at other packaging, things like aluminum and glass, for example, those are highly recyclable materials, and they have a much higher rate of recycling than plastic does because of that. So of all the plastic that we produce, and it's a lot, 33 million tons per year, roughly only 8% of that plastic actually gets recycled. So that's not just like you and me bringing our plastic to the recycling plant. It's once it gets to the recycling plant, it's not always actually recycled. And that has a lot to do with the types of plastic that we bring in and the types of plastic that a recycling center can handle. But only 8% in total gets recycled. And the reason why I want to mention this is that someone just asked a question, and I'll cover that in a minute. Thank you. So the reason why I want to talk about recycling is just that we really need to get out of that recycling mindset that a lot of us are in, and we really need to get into a reducing mindset. So recycling has been heralded as this great way to save the planet, and it really sounds great in theory, but in practice, it's simply not the best or the most effective way for us to help the planet, because it's as I mentioned earlier, focusing on the aftermath of the problem rather than the problem itself. So let's talk about the problem. This is a little graphic that I put together that kind of covers what I was talking about earlier when I was describing eco-minimalism. So it's looking at the full life cycle of a product. So starting all the way back from the resource extraction all the way through to disposal. I'm going to include some more research and resources on this topic because it's really kind of a big one and it's pretty nuanced. But this is just like a very quick overview of the life cycle. So starting at the beginning, and I hope you guys can see my cursor, but starting at the beginning, for any product, first resources have to be extracted. So whether it's going to be food, wood, metal, plastic, all of the products are going to require some kind of raw material that has to be created or extracted from the earth. So that can be things like oil, water, minerals, metal, all of that stuff. Then those materials move to the manufacturing process, which uses a lot of water and is one of the primary creators of greenhouse gases. From the factory, so that was that middle step right here, from the factory, it has to be transported. So it has to be transported from the factory to a warehouse or to a store so that it can be distributed. So these three steps, these ones at the top, are all things that happen prior to a product even reaching your hands. You and I have very little actual like physical contact with products when they're in these first three stages. And I really want to get into this because it's important to know that these first three steps, these top three steps right here, are extremely resource intensive. So when we're talking about that hidden water use, what we're looking at is these three steps that are before products get into our hands. So water is required for almost every step of the manufacturing process and is required for a lot of resource extraction. And then the bulk, as I mentioned, of any carbon and methane emissions from a product are made during these three steps, including transportation. So these three steps are really important, but where you and I come in is this fourth stage, which is the utilization stage. So this is when you have the item actually in your possession and you're using it. After that, it moves into the disposal phase, which can go through the landfill, composting, or recycling. Those are the three primary disposal methods. So those are the basic steps, and there's like nitty-gritty for each one. But those are the basic steps for any product. So that's going all the way from resource extraction all the way through to disposal. So roughly 6 steps. As I mentioned, most of the footprint for any product that you have in your possession is going to come before it reaches your hand, these first 3 steps. So that's why things like our water usage statistics are so high. Things like that cotton t-shirt that took 700 gallons of water to make, that all happens way before you and I even touch that cotton, right? So this graph can kind of make you feel, and it's understandable to feel this way, a little bit like maybe there's very little that you and I can do as a consumer to kind of help mitigate this, because we really don't enter the picture until this middle step. And at that point, almost all of the footprint has already been made. But I don't want us to look at it like that. Kind of think of it more as like, this is like a way that we can actually really make a big difference, because products only exist because there's a demand for them. So if we're purchasing products that are not resource intensive, or even better, by refraining from purchasing products as much as possible, we're basically eliminating the demand for resource intensive products, which is going to reduce the emissions, the water usage, et cetera, in these first 3 steps. And if you have any questions, I know people have been using the chat function, but you can also use the Q&A or the chat function. Feel free to pop them in there, and I'll get to them at the end. So this brings us to what I promised before, the easy sustainability tips. So we're going to be looking at tips that can make a big difference right away, but are easy to do or mostly passive. And to do that, we're going to go right back to that first R that we discussed, which is the reduce R. So reducing our carbon, methane emissions, our water, and our plastic use. The first easy way to do that that I'm going to recommend is to just stop buying stuff. So that's it. Just reduce the amount of demand on our natural resources by no longer buying new things. Obviously, that sounds easier than it is to do in practice, because we, of course, do need certain things in order to live and be healthy and happy. But what we really want to look at is eliminating our unnecessary purchases. So one of the things that we can do during this step before we go to buying anything is to ask ourselves these questions. So first question you want to ask yourself when you're thinking about buying anything at all, you want to ask yourself, do I really need this? Do I already own something that serves the same or similar function? If I do buy this item, what is the footprint for this item? So we're looking at all the resources that went into it, how it was produced, and how it was transported. So how far did it come in order to reach us? And then if I do decide to buy this product, is there a way for me to purchase it secondhand, which is obviously has no resource demand because it's already been created, or more sustainably? And then finally, what we want to ask ourselves is what's going to happen when we're finished with it? So is this something that we can give away? Is it going to be compostable? If you want to recycle it, is it actually going to be recycled? So is it something that you're just going to put into your recycling bin and hope for the best? Or is it something that you can guarantee is going to be recycled? So when we go through those, questions, it can really, and thank you, someone just popped another question into the chat and we will discuss that at the end. So if we go through these questions, we can really help ourselves prevent us from buying things that we might not have otherwise purchased or might otherwise not have thought about purchasing, thought twice before we purchase them. So I really recommend taking the time to go through this process with either some things that you already own. You can ask yourself, looking at like this mug, for example. I don't know if you guys can see that. Did I really need this? Do I already own multiple items that could have provided the same function? Did I choose the most sustainable option when I purchased this? And what will I do with it when I'm finished with it? Or you can kind of ask yourself for things that you envision yourself purchasing in the future, just get into the habit of asking yourself these questions. Can really sort of help break the kind of like mindless spending and consuming that we go through. So that's my quote unquote easy sustainability tip number one. Just don't buy stuff, or if you do, buy it with intention. So easy sustainability tip number two. And I know everybody hates to hear this, and I'm not going to encourage everyone here to go vegan. So if you do want to go vegan, definitely feel free to call me up and I'll get you started. But there's really no way to talk about environmental sustainability, especially the easiest steps that you can take towards sustainability, without talking about cutting back on animal products. Because like we mentioned earlier, methane, carbon, those things really do come from animal agriculture. So like I said, I'm not telling everyone to go vegan or even vegetarian, but one thing to know is that cutting out beef specifically in all forms is one of the biggest steps that you can take to reduce your carbon, methane, and water footprints basically all at once. So I know it doesn't necessarily sound easy, which I completely understand, but even if you're just doing it a little bit, getting on the trend, like there's this Meatless Monday thing that everybody's into, that's a really great way to get started on reducing your animal protein consumption. And it's a really I don't want to think of it as like a restriction. It's kind of a better way to think of it as like a challenge that can help you grow, because it gives you an opportunity to look into other protein sources, specifically plant-based proteins, and really try new things. So think of it less as like you're restricting yourself and more of like you're giving yourself an opportunity to try new things. So if you do have questions about that, certainly I'm happy to help with that. I myself am vegan, but the best thing to do is to actually talk to your doctor to ensure that you're going to be changing your diet safely. So many insurance companies and doctors actually are encouraging plant-based dieting, and that's because it's associated with better health outcomes, but it also has that benefit of being good for the environment. And I'll send out a couple of resources on that particular topic when I send out my resource list. And if you have more questions, certainly I'm happy to help. So that brings me to my third of and final, what I would consider easy, or maybe more like a lazy person, sustainability tip. And I'm not gonna lie, this is actually probably the hardest of them, but I'm gonna say it anyway, just because it's so important. So whenever possible, you want to try to avoid purchasing anything that's plastic or in plastic. So this includes single-serve plastics or single-use plastics like grocery bags, plastic utensils, water bottles, etc. But it also includes things that are wrapped in or come in plastic packaging, like shampoo bottles, detergents, disposable items like razors, plastic toothbrushes that come wrapped in plastic, all of those things. So that can obviously not be very easy because we have a very plastic saturated market. But one of the things that you can kind of look forward to is that sustainability is really becoming more mainstream. So it is becoming easier to find these things, and it's more affordable to find these things than it used to be. But if you're just looking to get started on this, like obviously it's very difficult to go entirely plastic free right away or at all. And the plastic is just it's just everywhere. So it's hard to avoid. But what you can do is start looking for things that are either made and shipped waterlessly. So that's things like soap bars and shampoo bars. That helps cut back on transportation costs, and also those things are typically shipped in not plastic containers. Or you can look for things that are made from bamboo, which is a highly sustainable material. Or you can look for things that are packaged in glass or aluminum, which I mentioned earlier, are much more recyclable than plastics. So like I mentioned, at this point, the market for sustainable products has really reached the point where you can get almost anything you can imagine plastic free. There's whole online shops that are dedicated to this. Anything that you want pretty much can be shipped to you or purchased in store plastic free. So that's really great. But before we move on, I just want to talk a little bit about this topic, which is that the ability to purchase sustainable options is not always available, especially for those who are on a lower or a fixed income. Sometimes sustainable options are just more expensive. Frankly, they're often more expensive, and they're often more difficult to obtain than mass-produced plastic counterparts. That's because they're mostly, online. You have to pay shipping, et cetera, et cetera. So definitely we want to acknowledge that. So for people who are maybe experiencing that or having that moment right now when they're thinking about avoiding all plastic in the future, which is not really that feasible, just kind of know and don't feel discouraged by this. Just think of it as just try to be encouraged, I guess is what I want to say, by the fact that sustainable options are becoming more accessible and more affordable every day. And just know that what you can do and what's within your personal income and ability level, that's great. Like, that's totally okay to only do the things that you feel that you're capable of doing. I don't want anyone to feel like this is like totally outside of their reach, or that doing some small thing like buying one bamboo toothbrush or whatever is like not going to matter that much, because truthfully, these things add up, and doing what you can is, you know, it's better than the alternative. And the earth really needs all that we can do, even though we can't do all, you know, everything. Just trying to do what you can, if that makes sense. Okay, so I wanted to also, since we have a little time here, cover a couple of extra tips, I guess I'd call it. These are things that I wouldn't necessarily put under that category of like lazy person sustainability kit items, but they're still helpful. And before this, I did get some questions sent to my email about, is this going to be covered? So here are a couple additional things. The first of these steps, these like intermediate or extra steps, is what we call the zero waste kit. So I'm sure probably everybody has heard about zero waste kits at this point. They're really kind of like trendy. It's like a buzzword right now, but basically what it is a collection of items that you carry with you that are going to enable you to reduce the number of single-use plastics you need to purchase while you're on the go. So I put together a list here on this screen, but this is just like a basic list. And if anybody wants, I can send out this recommended list at the end. But I would really encourage you to, you know, add, take away, create a list that really works best for you. So work on your own sustainability kit, your own zero waste kit. There's no point in, you know, carrying stuff with you that you're not going to use, and some things might not be on this list, but you absolutely need them. So just keep those things in mind. Whatever works for you in your sustainability kit, if you decide to go with this route, is perfectly okay. There's no like minimum, maximum, or whatever to make it qualify as a zero waste kit. But what I don't want you to do, though, when you're looking at these kinds of lists, is think that you need to go out and purchase a zero waste kit. There are a lot of people who are putting together these zero waste kits and then selling them online. But the best thing really to do for the environment is to use what you already have rather than purchasing something new. So that's what we were talking about with sustainability tip number one, which is, you know, just don't buy new things. So when you're trying to put together, if you decide to do this, put together your zero waste kit, just go to your own kitchen and just, you know, find a spare set of utensils if you have them. I'm sure a lot of us have reusable water bottles. We gave them out at the center before. Most people have those reusable shopping bags because we've got that like 10-cent fee or whatever now for using plastic ones here in Oregon. So just look at what you already have and try to use things that are in your own house before you go out and purchase something new. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at a zero waste kit. So my second extra sustainability tip here is going to be advocacy. So advocacy is one of the biggest things that you can do to make an impact on climate change. But I'll just go right ahead and say that it's really not always easy, and it's not always rewarding. So it can involve contacting your representatives, coordinating with others, encourage them to do the same, and it can really take a lot of work. So it's not what I would consider one of my easy tips, but it is a really great tip if you find yourself with the capacity to do it. We are actually really fortunate, and I'm excited to talk about this. We're really fortunate here in Tualatin because we do have people in our government who are passionate about this topic. And I want to thank and welcome Councillor Brooks, who's going to be joining us today. She's going to speak just at the end after a cover a couple of questions, just to like kind of talk a little bit about what we as the city of Tualatin are doing. But there are more steps outside of governmental actions that we can take as individuals. So we can support sustainable brands. That's a really great way to vote with your dollars because we live in a capitalist society and the trends are where the money is. So you can keep if we can keep that sustainability trending for long enough, then by purchasing only from or mostly from brands that are practicing transparency around their supply chain and their production methods, that we can really make a huge difference in that way. So like I said before, though, purchasing from sustainable brands can be really difficult. They can be hard to find. They're not always size inclusive, which is unfortunate. And they can be more expensive than their non-sustainably produced counterparts. So if you are looking to make a purchase and you can afford it, definitely looking into a sustainable brand can really make a big difference to your personal overall footprint. So last tip here, because I don't want us to run out of time. So my last tip here is about offsetting. So specifically, I want to talk about carbon offsetting, because it's really kind of the only readily available offsetting that we have as the general public right now. So the idea behind carbon offsetting is fairly simple. It's essentially investing in carbon reducing and carbon absorbing projects that in order to counteract the amount of carbon that we're producing annually. So these projects can be things like tree planting and infrastructure improvements that can result in carbon either being absorbed back from the atmosphere or preventing additional carbon in the future. So you've probably heard a lot of companies that are putting out statements recently that they're aiming for carbon neutrality. Amazon, for example, I think that they said 2040 is when they're aiming for net zero carbon across their businesses. There's also a lot of businesses that currently right now are already doing that. So like Etsy, for example, which is an online marketplace, they're already practicing carbon offsetting for all of their business. So carbon offsetting is not free, but it is very easy to do. So there are two great options that I recommend for this. So TerraPass, which is the one that I use, and Go Climate, they both calculate your carbon footprint for you, and then they allow you to pay monthly to invest in their carbon offsetting projects. It typically costs between like $5 and $20 a month, but that's depending mostly on your consumer habits. I will include those resources when I send out my follow-up email, which will probably come out tomorrow, which is Friday, or Monday. So that was very long-winded of me. Let's try to answer some questions. So go ahead and use, if you have any questions, the Q&A function and the chat function, and I will do my very best. Like I mentioned before, I'm not an expert. I know what I've said, but I'm not like the end-all expert on this. So I'll try to answer things, but if I can't, then I'll just include resources when I send them out. Okay. Do you have production, use, and recycle costs for electric versus fossil fueled vehicles? So there is a little bit of research about this topic. And what I'll say from what I know is that it's typically best to continue to use your current vehicle for as long as you can, because the impact of creating a new car is significant. It does have a lot of footprint behind it. So trying to use your current vehicle for as long as it's sustainable to do so is generally the best advice. But when it is time for you to be looking at a new vehicle, the best thing to do is to look for, first of all, a secondhand vehicle because it doesn't have an additional footprint associated with it. And then to look into things that will work for you, either hybrid or electric. So I hope that answers your question. I will include more information on that topic when I send out the resource guide. So I answered that question. And then I think there were some chat questions. Okay. Isn't Indonesia responsible for largest portion of plastics globally? That is possible. I don't have the statistics on which country produces the most plastics. However, what I will say is that we all, including Indonesia and every country out there, should really look at reducing the amount of plastics that we produce and that we use. Next question is, I'm all for reducing the products that we use, but fellow Americans do, to a great extent, depend on consumer buying to produce jobs. How do we balance that? That's an excellent question. That's a really good question. So the thing that we want to do is try to support sustainable brands so that we can continue to support the people who are producing items. So the more sustainable we can make our production, the better off we're going to be. And one of the really great things about sustainable brands is they typically have like better, like, I don't know how to phrase this, like their employees are typically better off and more well taken care of because sustainable brands are aiming for transparency. So if you can try to think of it that way, and we're not necessarily trying to eliminate jobs here, what we're trying to think about is how can we keep the economy going without being solely consumer driven, and how can we consume in such a way that it's not going to be super damaging to the environment, if that makes sense. So let's see, we have a couple of, in addition to the reusable shopping bags, which I think this question was probably referring to my zero waste kit recommendation. So someone has suggested reusable produce bags also exist. Yes, that's a great option. If you do use produce bags in general, then yes, switching over to reusable ones is a really great idea. I personally just kind of like let my vegetables kind of like roam free when I go grocery shopping, but reusable produce bags are really, really helpful, and they come in a variety of types, but you can just like tear out the weight so that you're not paying for the cost of like the weight of the bag when you purchase anything. Local buy nothing groups on Facebook, also a great resource for secondhand items. Yes, totally agree with that. If you are looking for something, buying secondhand, or even better, getting something secondhand for free is a really great idea. Yeah, and groups like Buy Nothing on Facebook are a really good way to do that. From Councillor Brooks, thank you. Sustainable index funds and investments are available as well. Yes, that is true. There are ways to invest your money in like more green and eco-friendly options. I'm not an investment banker by any means, so definitely recommend doing a little research for yourself. Then we have another question about buying online. Okay, so the internet is a double-edged sword, is it not? It's really great in that we have access to a lot of different things and options, and as consumers, we definitely can access more sustainable brands that way. However, there is a matter of where are these things coming from? Where is this shop based? You know, how far are things traveling, and in what way are they traveling to reach me when I order something online? So for that, you kind of have to like kind of weigh, you know, like the footprint of transportation versus like the footprint of something physical that you can buy in a store. So if you're looking at purchasing a sustainable piece of clothing online versus purchasing something that's made from some kind of like acrylic or polyester kind of fabric that you buy in Fred Meyer, you have to think that when you go to Fred Meyer and you purchase something like that, it has already been transported from wherever it was made to Fred Meyer. So that transportation is already included. When you're ordering online, is it worse than that item having gone to Fred Meyer? Not necessarily. So think about it in that way, that unless you are purchasing something from the place where it is being made, where the resources are from, if you're going to that physical shop and picking it up, then in terms of buying online, most of the time it's kind of negligible, if that makes sense. the only other thing I will say is that the internet has given us access to a lot of things that we don't necessarily need. So just keep that in mind when you're looking online for sustainable options. The best thing to do is not buy anything that you don't need. Okay, and then we have one more question in the Q&A, two more. So Indonesia may have gotten that title, but it can be mostly contributed to developed countries recycling incorrectly and sending it to Asia. Yes. So pretty recently there was a thing where maybe a couple of years, everything, the time warp around COVID has kind of messed with my brain a little bit. But a couple of years ago, I think China stopped accepting our recycling, and that caused a big problem for us. But one of the things that happens when we're sending our recycling overseas is that typically not necessarily being recycled there. It's just kind of like out of sight, out of mind. So that is a really good point. Thank you. And then we have a couple more questions. Kiss the Ground is a good documentary on Netflix. Yes, it is, about food resources and carbon and methane. So thank you for that, Councillor Brooks. I'm actually, that is already on my resource list. So I will include that when I send it out. There's also a book that documentary is based on, and that will be on the resource list as well. And then last one, can/will Tualatin be mandating more recycling, especially plastics not collected curbside? Can Tualatin join the network of Portland James Recycling or Riddell to collect and recycle more types of plastic? This is actually a great segue because I am going to stop sharing my screen and I am going to promote Councillor Brooks to a panelist. She had to leave the webinar and then she'll come back in as a panelist. There she is. So Councillor Brooks, whenever you're ready, if you want to speak a little bit about what Tualatin is doing, I would greatly appreciate that.
There we go. Thank you so much. And thank you for doing this. This is a topic that we both find near and dear to our hearts. And when I saw this pop up on my Facebook, I was so enthused and appreciate the invitation to come and share a little bit about what Tualatin's doing here around sustainability. I will say one of the first items that I worked on when I first came on, I'm halfway through my first term as one of your city councilors. And the first year, I think, I started working on becoming a certified B City. So my background is in clinical social work. So I was very concerned about the impacts on brain health of some of the pesticides that are used on in our street sides and parks and yards and businesses. And I thought a good example would be to be part of the B City USA group done by Xerces to support our pollinators. And we were able to become part of the B City USA group. And we have a process. We're working on an integrated pest management program within the city so that our parks and street sides are safer, and all, like our river, et cetera, are also safer and have less pesticides in them. And the people that work doing the services for the city are also protected against some of the risks like cancer. So I was very proud. And then the kids, also we know about brain development around neurotoxins. So that was my first big concern. And there are ways of managing our own yards with reducing pesticide use as well. And I encourage people to look into that and get involved. There's a whole part on our website through the Parks Department around B City USA, so you can see where we are in the process and the progress that we've made. Also, I wanted to discuss, we also have Tree City, which I'm a little bit less familiar with, but we all know that The trees are sort of the lungs of our planet, and we as a city have been invested in being a tree city for over 30 years. And we have seen the devastation from the extreme climate change and the climate storms that we've had with the ice storms recently. And I'm sure I'm not the only one that lost trees during that storm. So being mindful of our trees and being good stewards of our trees is something that the city's been invested in for a long, long time. I like to look through a focus of resiliency. When I work with individuals, I want them to be resilient, and community resiliency is really important. And I realize that people and communities don't operate in a vacuum, that we all are connected to our environment. So I would like to say that that I look through a person in environment lens as a social worker, and that has expanded in thinking as time has gone on and evolved in my profession. There are a couple things that are coming up that are a little controversial that I think people should know about. There's a Basalt Creek extension proposed by the county. So this is a great place where you can do advocacy and look into that project. It goes over, it's part of the urban growth boundary that will become part of Tualatin, running south on Boone's Ferry Road. And that's a truck traffic divergence. It was originally supposed to go up to the freeway and has been redesigned to go over a pristine canyon and go on to Boone's Ferry Road through residential and near schools. And many of us on council are very concerned about this plan that was developed a long time ago before some of the current neighborhoods and residences were there. So something to be aware of. There was a presentation at last city council that talks about that. And then finally, I'm gonna mention and do a little plug. I am starting a nonprofit myself called the Tualatin Sustainability Network. I plan to launch it around Earth Day this year. And so if you're interested in learning more about sustainability and doing acts of service and connecting with other community members, that's the mission of the organization. We would love to have you. And you're welcome to just send me an email at bbrooks at tualatin.gov and just let me know you're interested, and then I can put you on the interest list. So I imagine that we'll have an opening Zoom guest speaker that should be pretty exciting, as well as some service projects focused towards Earth Day and celebrating that and connecting with other organizations, and plan to try to work with neighborhoods, schools, and businesses to connect with each other and come up with solutions to help mitigate some of the issues that we're facing already, as well as provide more resiliency to ourselves and each other and the other inhabitants that live in Tualatin. And I'm happy to answer any questions if anyone has questions, if we have time. It's up to you, of course.
We have 5 minutes. And
okay,
thank you so much, Councillor Brooks. We actually do already have a question for you.
Great. I love talking about advocacy too. So if you ever want to learn about anything, like if you want to get involved and you don't know where to go or how to write a letter or want to write a editorial, I'm happy to discuss those options because we want to hear from you.
Yeah, great. So, and I will include both my contact information and Councillor Brooks's information when I send out that resource email tomorrow. But we do already have a question for you, Councillor Brooks. Is it possible to promote and help make citizens aware of the backyard habitat program? Around a year ago, it opened up to Washington County residents, and it seems to go quite well with the efforts of Bee City and Tree City.
Well, this is a wonderful question for me. Actually, it just became part of the Tualatin City. I think it was the year before last. The city has some grants that we support. The only grant, community grant that we're supporting that helps with the environment currently is for the Backyard Habitat Program. We've just started supporting that program as a city. And then me as starting the Tualatin Sustainability Network, the backyard habitat and raising awareness around the backyard habitat. And I want to double back to something that was shared about earlier, also drought resistant planting and native planting, supporting the pollinators. And even though drinking water may not be the largest source of water usage, we have limited water from Bull Run. And some of the concerns for me have been drought, climate change, and population growth. And I'm also the council liaison to the Water Consortium for Drinking Water. And I'm very interested in water and water quality. And because of the conservation efforts of people in the metro region, we have built capacity around water and don't have the water shortages that were anticipated years ago. So even though it might not have the biggest impact globally, these local impacts are also highly important and highly valuable to the habitat, the inhabitants, both people and animals and other living beings on the planet. So I just want to be really clear on, these small acts that you can do, even though it might not fix the whole big problem. And a lot of the stuff, which I love that Marilyn talked about, there's also really measurable outcomes that happen from conservation, how we plant, the backyard habitat program, all of that. And we also have resources on the same page with Bee City and connections to the Water Consortium. I think they have over 200 suggestions of native and drought resistant plants that you can look at as springtime comes around and you might be considering doing some planting, which seems to be a safe thing to do during COVID. Any other questions? Thank you so much for the question.
Yeah, it doesn't look like we have any more questions and we are running out of time.
Okay.
So I do want to thank you so much, Councillor Brooks, for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure.
Thank you to all the attendees. I hope that you got a little something out of this. You're always welcome to contact me, contact Councillor Brooks about any questions. I will be following up with a resource list and I will make sure that I cover, I'll include Bee City and I will include that backyard habitat thing so that we can start looking locally as well as globally. So thank you all so much. Have a really great afternoon and we'll see you next time.